I'm Cruz. Welcome to the online course on responding to climate risks in agriculture and natural resources management. Today I will cover with you Module 3 entitled Vulnerability Assessment and Introduction. Particularly, I will discuss with you climate change, vulnerability, and its basic concepts. Let us begin by defining vulnerability. Vulnerability to climate change is defined as the risk of adverse things happening due to climate-related events, or simply, it refers to the susceptibility of being affected by climate change. There are several events associated with climate change to which one can be vulnerable to, and this include increase in temperature. As shown in the slide, temperature is projected to increase by as much as 4 degrees centigrade in the next century. And this is a result of various global circulation model runs of IPCC. Extreme rainfall event is also projected to increase in frequency as a result of climate change. The slides show the rainfall anomalies of the last century that has been increasing in intensity, and this is projected to increase in the coming years. Sea level rise is also projected to increase as a result of climate change, and this will affect coastal areas, coastal communities and ecosystems, and even marine ecosystems in varying degrees. Hydrologic cycle will also be enhanced as a result of increasing precipitation in the future. And increasing precipitation will mean increase in surface runoff, increase in stream flow that will increase the frequency of occurrence of flood events and even of rain-induced landslides. Information on vulnerability is useful in adaptation planning, particularly in the design, prioritization and evaluation of adaptation strategies. Information on who are vulnerable, what places are vulnerable, will be essential in designing suitable adaptation strategies. Vulnerability is a function of 3 interrelated factors, namely exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. Now let's look at them one by one. Exposure is defined as the risk from climate change, for instance, population, crops, and property. It is also defined as the climate change that an affected system will face, such as sea level rise, increase in temperature, precipitation, and extreme events. On the other hand, sensitivity refers to the biophysical effect of climate change. Change in runoff patterns and change in energy demand. It also refers to the responsiveness to climate stimuli. For instance, grain crops are typically sensitive. Studies have shown that grain crops like rice and corn are sensitive to even the slightest increase in temperature. They are more sensitive than manufacturing, which is typically much less sensitive because of the fact that they are not dependent on climate, particularly temperature and rainfall. Adaptive capacity refers to the capability to adapt or the capability to make adjustments so as to minimize or to cope with the impacts of climate change. Adaptive capacity is a function of several factors, some of which are wealth, technology, education, institutions, information, and infrastructure. High exposure and high sensitivity increases vulnerability. On the other hand, if you have high adaptive capacity, the vulnerability is usually decreasing. Now let's look at some of the common vulnerabilities to climate change. We begin with the poor. The poor are most vulnerable, particularly those living in critical areas such as rivers and coastline. The poor are vulnerable not only because of their location, but also because of the fact that they have little assets that they can use for adaptation. People living along steep slopes are also vulnerable to climate change. As you can see from this, as you can see on the screen, we have here a big landslide that occurred in southern Leyte in central Philippines, where a whole community was buried under this landslide. There was even one elementary school full of children that got buried here. Ecosystems most threatened by climate change include coral reefs, mangroves, other coastal wetlands, remnant forests, high latitude and high altitude forests, including the cloud forests or the mossy forests, fragmented forests, and other ecosystems highly disturbed by human activities. Natural forests along agricultural areas are vulnerable to future climate. Once the currently farmed areas become unproductive due to adverse climate conditions, the tendency will be to look for other areas to be farmed. And natural forests, because of their inherent fertility, are most vulnerable to this expansion. Areas that are already susceptible to forest fires, such as the one that you can see on the screen, will become more vulnerable to future climate, especially in the event of long dry season and warm dry season. Finally, highly erodible areas along river banks are also going to become more vulnerable to future climate. As rainfall is projected to increase in the future, stream flows are also expected to increase, thereby increasing riverbank erosion. This concludes my first lecture for this module. Thank you very much.